What do you get when a fragmented gaseous nebula in space either stays a nebula or forms into a star? On Earth, that would be the formation of a religion in our human understanding. This was exactly the case in the mid-20th century with the hippie movement. Some call it counterculture. I call it the formation of a new culture, maybe the revival of a old culture, but in a postmodern sense. Today, we're going to be looking at the failed religion of Hippism, or the hippie movement. Why did it form? What was it about? What were some of the vast competing cults within it? And not to mention what hippies did after the movement. Let's get into it. So, here is hippies, hallucinogens, and Hinduism. Now, the mid-1960s, rock and roll was radically evolving from Chuck Berry's first iteration, and he himself was ripe with the sort of liberation of rock in the 1960s, as was new artists at the time. Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin was a pioneering figure in women's rock, and the Beatles, of course. Now, the counterculture can be, or the new culture, the hippie culture itself, can be summed up at least in Jimi Hendrix's Axis Bold as Love album cover. And it was appropriated from a Virat Purushan Vishnuumpan, which is an image so famous in India that its ubiquity can only be compared to the images of Jesus Christ in the Western world. And instead, this time, the Hindu god Vishnu is replaced with Hendrix himself. He was seen as the hippie god, and there's a reason why it was banned in Malaysia. It was bold, blasphemous, a little bit trippy. It was offensive to the Hindu population in Malaysia. So whether Hendrix intended it or not, it reads as a colossal middle finger to mainstream America, replacing Christianity with Hinduism, and the white and holy Jesus face with a black Cherokee psychedelic rock star, mixed race, and all just a few years after the end of Jim Crow. And instead of a traditional religion, it represents the cult of flower power, the creed of peace, love, and a lot of LSD. And the whole thing was an acid-dripped mistake, according to this this article writer. Interesting. Though it can be perceived as a statement about hippie lifestyle and analogous to its relationship with Eastern faith, the flamboyant cover of Axis Bold in Love was really just a giant mistake. Hendrix said that the music in Axis is based on a very, very simple American Indian style. He wanted to pay tribute to his Cherokee roots on the album cover. However, his record label confused his reference to India with the South Asian country, and Roger Law replaced the image of Hendrix and his bandmates on that of an Indian religious poster. Hendrix claimed, quote, "The three of us had nothing to do with what's on the Axis cover. The image used on the cover, a Hindu devotional painting called Virat Purushan Vishnuumpan, depicts the supreme god Vishnu with Krishna in the center, representing mankind, the evil deities to the left and the good deities to the right, representing the balance between good and evil." And so The cover art, albeit a mistake, accurately represents the hippie ethos. In fact, its accidental nature is akin to that of the counterculture's obsession with Eastern religion. Through a genuine spiritual endeavor for some, for many hippies and rock stars, Indian iconography was little more than a psychedelic fad, a natural byproduct of the hippie lifestyle. The counterculture movement, as it descended from movements such as the Beats from the 1950s, Transcendentalism, and, not to mention occult revivalism, Aleister Crowley, and Gnosticism. All of which were greatly influenced by Eastern faith, and it shares many core tenets with Indian religion. And beyond just the practice of meditation, yoga, and the ideal of spiritual liberation, which is central to both cultures, the ultimate objective of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism, deliverance from the endless cycles of rebirth before life, is only attainable by overcoming all earthly desires. So, the hippie emphasis on nonconformity, on, quote, dropping out, or liberating oneself from the evils of mainstream culture. That would include buying brands, so hippies bought secondhand, and they had a culture of homegrown food. So the inner peace that follows sounds a lot like the Indian beliefs of moksha and nirvana. The Indian emphasis on asceticism is echoed by the counterculture's renouncement of all things mainstream. To embrace the hippie lifestyle was to abandon one's ties with most conventional of American values. Most hippies were white, middle-class young adults who, because of economic prosperity, had all the time in the world to protest and do drugs. Representative of a societal generational tension, they rebelled against the values of their parents, which was not limited to the segregation, the Vietnam War, an obsession with materialism, traditional gender roles, homophobia, and the Western way of life. Instead, they sought a lifestyle of peace, love, sex, and drugs, thanks to the emergence of birth control pills, the availability of Mexican marijuana, and a huge number of baby boom youth in the flower power movement took America's youth by storm. And at the time, psychedelic drugs such as LSD were legal. And they were the perfect outlet to transcend consciousness and explore spirituality. From the purple haze came a fascination with meditation, yoga, astrology, Native American mysticism, and Eastern religion. So, what we're getting at here is the decline in obedience to mainstream organized Christian churches, the emergence of alternative spirituality, including atheism as well. That was very much on the rise in the 1960s with all of these radical progressive movements as well. So, half a rejection of their parents' values and half the perfect supplement to an acid trip, hippies were fascinated with Eastern religion, primarily Buddhism and Hinduism. The 1960s counterculture is considered as the heir of the Beats. The term Beat Generation was coined in 1948 to describe an underground youth movement and was a rebellion against all things traditional, conservative, and conventionally American. They passed down their interest in Eastern religion, particularly Zen Buddhism, to the hippies. So the beatniks were the generational precursor to the hippies. So they were like the older kids who, about 10 years before, were doing all this stuff before it was cool, but they had a lot more uphill battle at that time, and they couldn't achieve what the hippies achieved in terms of all of this pop culture change in such a short amount of time. So, in the 1970 article in Time magazine, it describes Zen Buddhism's core tenets of, quote, inward meditation versus doctrine, of emphasis on the visceral and spontaneous against the cerebral and structured, of inspiration rather than linear logic. So, the way the hippies saw it, Buddhism and Hinduism, transcendental achieving of perfect inner peace, meant an adoption of a complete subjectiveness of reality. That is very much a part of the postmodernist philosophy, and sort of doing away with objective beliefs, well, at least empirical beliefs, and kind of all-out pseudoscience. Now, all things that would fascinate a hippie on shrooms, which is exactly this. Hippies were also drawn to Hinduism, inspired by Indian teachers and gurus who taught in America as early as the 1890s. Well, I didn't know that. Some of them, including Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, who the Beatles lived with in India in 1968, became celebrities and encouraged Americans to experiment with yoga, meditation, and mysticism. Although Indian gurus advised them against it, the hippies used marijuana and hallucinogens as a gateway to spiritual enlightenment. Well, we can say enlightenment as a very loose sense because it's all just they believed it was enlightenment because there was no law against using psychedelic drugs. To some it fueled creativity, and to others it at least gave them the illusion of something high, probably because they were high. Thus, the hippie obsession with Eastern mysticism was more of a fetish. I cannot say this word. I should be able to. It was a fetishization of Eastern and genuine religious Eastern philosophy and faith. So, soon the hippies from all over burned incense, had Buddhas in their houses, listened to Indian music, wore mala beads and colorful Indian-style clothing, tie-dye. And they became vegetarian. They meditated. So, like the Hendrix album cover, as we had previously mentioned, Eastern mysticism in counterculture was simply the product of a lifestyle of peace, pot, and peyote. I think that's the word. I've never encountered that word before. Okay, another staple of the counterculture movement was psychedelic rock. There was literally an entire music genre in the late 1960s that was devoted to the drugs, the strange psychedelic noises of, in the middle of songs, and the use of electronics. The deafening sound of feedback and the loud, roaring electric guitar. Its birthplace was the Golden State, California, where the early Grateful Dead performed at the Ken Kesey's Acid Test multimedia, or quote, the happenings. The movement spread like wildfire from San Francisco across the country, all over to Europe, absorbing some of rock's greatest bands: Jefferson Airplane, Quicksilver Messenger Service, and Big Brother, and the Holding Company in San Francisco, the Doors, the Byrds in Los Angeles, the Velvet Underground in New York City, the Yardbirds, and later Led Zeppelin, Jeff Beck, and the Jimi Hendrix Experience. The Rolling Stones included, Donovan, the Kinks, early Pink Floyd, The Who, and the Beatles, of course. This music was not only inspired by psychedelics. Some of the most famous songs of that era, such as the Beatles' Lucy in the Sky with Diamonds, and with a little help from my friends, were a love letter to this massive movement. So, San Francisco was the mecca of the counterculture movement. Not only was it the birthplace of psychedelic rock, but it famously attracted about 100,000 people to its Haight-Ashbury neighborhood in the Summer of Love in 1967, where their music, hallucinogens, free sex, and political activism flourished. As the hippie lifestyle for the first time was brought to the global spotlight, which it peaked in 67. However, the quote, the ultimate high and the major spiritual event of the San Francisco hippie era took place not during the Summer of Love, but months earlier at a fundraiser for a Hindu organization. Mantra Rock Dance started as a local benefit to raise money for the International Society for Krishna Consciousness, or ISKCON, or Hare Krishna. Ring any bell to any baby boomers watching? Probably. ISKCON was founded by A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada, a guru in the school of Vaishnavite Hinduism, which worships Krishna as its central deity. Within a few years, his group was a spectacle on the streets of New York, with their signature yellow robes, shaved heads, street dancing and chanting, classes, and free food for the community. In 1966, he chose Mukunda Das to spearhead the establishment of a San Francisco temple in late 1966. So, in effort to fundraise and gain followers, he decided to indulge in San Francisco's psychedelia and host a rock benefit at the temple. Of course, this decision invited a lot of controversy among the group. They preached abstention from alcohol and drugs, celibacy, and monogamous marriage, but they knew everyone there would be drunk, high, sexually active, and polygamous. However, the beat poet Allen Ginsberg convinced Prabhupada that, quote, there was a spiritual hunger that he could fill. Prabhupada agreed. Within days, psychedelic posters for the event lined the streets of Haight-Ashbury and nearby colleges. The flyer, designed by Harvey Cohen, was one of the first Hare Krishnas, is second only to Axis Bold as Love with the psychedelic imagery. Crooked purple letters read, quote, bring cushions, drums, bells, cymbals, proceeds, opening of a San Francisco Krishna temple. So performing at the benefit were the Grateful Dead, Big Brother, and the Holding Company, with lead singer Janis Joplin. Two of the Bay Area's most popular psychedelic bands, and Moby Grape, then a little-known band whose performance that night would earn them acclaim and a record deal. When Prabhupada arrived on the West Coast, the San Francisco Chronicle asked him if he would let in the hippies. And he said, quote, hippies are anyone. I make no distinctions. Everyone is welcome. End quote. So by 8 p.m. on Sunday, January 29th, hippie heaven was open for business. 3,000 hippies flocked to the doors of the Avalon Ballroom for $2.50 per person and into psychedelic Narnia. Also in attendance was a lot of marijuana and a lot of LSD, courtesy of Harvard acid enthusiast Timothy Leary and his buddy Owsley Stanley III, the manufacturer of notoriously potent LSD, who were handing out hundreds of hits in the crowd. Satsavarupa Dasa Goswami, Prabhupada's biographer, sets the scene. So, he wrote, quote, "Almost everyone who came wore bright or unusual costumes, tribal robes, Mexican ponchos, Indian kurtas, God's eyes, feathers, and beads. Some hippies brought their own flutes, lutes, gourds, drums, rattles, horns, and guitars. The Hell's Angels, dirty-haired, wearing jeans, boots, and denim jackets, all accompanied by their women, made their entrance, carrying chains, smoking cigarettes, and displaying their regalia of German helmets, emblazoned emblems, and so on. Everything but their motorcycles, which they had parked outside. About 10 p.m. following a trippy Hindu light show and a meal of sanctified orange slices, Prabhupada made his entrance. His biographer described, quote, "He looked like a Vedic sage, exalted and otherworldly. As he advanced towards the stage and the crowd parted and made way for him. And like the surfer riding the wave, he glided into the stage, sat down, and began playing the cardles, or ritual finger symbols. Allen Ginsberg introduced and welcomed Prabhupada to the stage, but somewhere along the way he spoke of chanting as the perfect descent from their high and a way to, quote, stabilize their consciousness upon re-entry. After Prabhupada addressed the audience, Ginsberg led them in the Hare Krishna chant, so he led the crowd, which after a few minutes broke out into a full-on flash mob. Prabhupada was the first to begin dancing. He was soon followed by the members of the bands who accompanied it in their instruments. The crowd played along with their instruments and danced into the night. Afterwards, the Grateful Dead and Big Brother and the Holding Company played hours past midnight. The event was a smashing success. Not only did they raise $2,000, but membership skyrocketed at the temple, and Prabhupada rose to national prominence. Going on speaking tours across the country and establishing dozens of temples. Soon, members of the ISKCON San Francisco team were sent to London, where they famously befriended George Harrison and the Beatles, mostly George Harrison. So, February 1967, Harrison's wife, Patty Boyd, saw a newspaper ad for transcendental meditation classes. Boyd, who was seeking spirituality in her life, began attending the classes, and her husband soon joined her. In August, the Harrisons and the rest of the Fab Four, the Beatles, sat in on a lecture in London by Maharishi Mahesh Yogi, the leader of the Transcendental Meditation movement. Boyd wrote in her memoir, Wonderful Night, Maharishi was every bit as impressive as I thought he would be. We were spellbound, end quote. The same group alongside Mick Jagger and the Marianne Faithfull then attended a 10-day conference of the Spiritual Regeneration Movement in Bangor, Wales. It was there that the Fab Four announced that they would finally say goodbye to drugs. Quote, "It was an experience we went through. Now it's over and we don't need it anymore," end quote, said McCartney. Although the Fab Four never really recovered from their drug problem. Except maybe Ringo. Because he's apparently living forever, that guy. However, while they were all at the conference, they received news of the tragic death of their manager, Brian Epstein. As a result, Maharishi invited the Fab Four to live at his ashram in Rishikesh. The Beatles, their wives and girlfriends, alongside with singer Donovan, actress Mia Farrow, Mike Lowe, and the Beach Boys, arrived in India around February 1968. The ashram was a lot like one of those socialist summer camps Alvy Singer rambles about. It was built in 1963 on a 14-acre plot in the forest. There were 6 long bungalows, each with 5 or 6 double rooms, and flowers and greenery all around. George Harrison and John Lennon were there to meditate. They were fascinated by Maharishi's words, and they were finally able to sit back and relax after years of drugs and fame. Paul McCartney, locked himself in a room for 5 days to meditate and wrote hundreds of songs. George did not fool around when it came to his spiritual journey, Paul McCartney recalls. McCartney says, he was quite strict. I remember talking about the next album, and he would say, we're not going to talk about music, we're going to meditate. End quote of my McCartney accent. After a long day of lounging, meditation, and songwriting, all the musicians would play together. Their photographer, Saltzman, wrote, quote, the weeks the Beatles spent at the ashram were a uniquely calm and creative oasis for them. Meditation, vegetarian food, and the gentle beauty of the foothills of the Himalayas, where there were no fans, no press, no rushing around with busy schedules, and in this freedom, in this single capsule of time, they created more great music than any in similar period with their illustrious careers. The great music he was referring to, of course, was the White Album. Sophomore Sarah Abnat, a Beatles fanatic, I'm sorry if I mispronounced her name, is struck by the diversity of their 1968 masterpiece. Okay, so just skipping a little bit of this. George Harrison practiced Hinduism, specifically Hare Krishna, until the day he died. In 1966, he traveled to India to study the sitar, and it was there that he met Maharishi for the first time, beyond just an escape from the drugs and the startup. So this is like even before all of the Beatles made their journey in '68 to India. Beyond the escape from the drugs and the stardom, he needed to see God to believe it. In the introduction to Swami Prabhupada's book, Krishna, or If There's a God, I Want to See Him, it's pointless to believe in something without proof, and Krishna consciousness and meditation are methods where you can actually obtain God perception. In that way, you can see, hear, and play with God. Perhaps this may sound weird, but God is really there next to you, end quote. So when George Harrison died on November 29th, 2001, at the age of 58, he was surrounded by images of Lord Rama and Lord Krishna. In his will, he left 20 million British pounds for ISKCON, the Hare Krishna World Organization, and he wished for his body to be cremated in the Ganges in India, a holy site for Hindus. His faith was very evident in his music, as seen in the albums the Hare Krishna mantra, My Sweet Lord, All Things Must Pass, Living in the Material World, and Chants of India. His most popular song, My Sweet Lord, equates Hare Krishna with Hallelujah, which Leonard Cohen popularized. In 1969, the Beatles produced the single Hare Krishna Mantra, which Harrison performed alongside the congregants of the Radha Krishna Temple. I can't roll my R's, I apologize. He has songs with references to the Bhagavad Gita, to Prabhupada, to yoga, and the list goes on. So, eventually, the Beatles' interest in Indian religion was not merely a fad, unlike Jimi Hendrix, the Grateful Dead, and Big Brother and the Holding Company. The Beatles did not think of Hinduism as just an acid trip. They did not appropriate Indian iconography for a psychedelic aesthetic, or to make a statement about the hippie lifestyle. Nothing about their interest in Hinduism was tokenistic. it was 100% spiritual and creative. All of this music, regardless of whether or not it explicitly mentioned religion, was created with Hinduism as the backdrop. It is no coincidence that they were perhaps at their creative apex at the ashram. They meditated, reflected, and liberated themselves from the troubles of their lives. Of course, they had to return to make their next albums. But thus, the Beatles' relationship with Hinduism is representative of the portion of the hippie population that did genuinely adhere to the Eastern faith. The population who didn't just wear Indian clothing and pick and choose just a few traditions to fit a trend. It is no surprise that many hippies were attracted to Indian religious traditions with a tablet of LSD, and altogether it was very potent. They likely felt otherworldly. Sorry, I didn't mean to stutter there. However, therein lies the contradiction between genuine devotion to Eastern tradition and psychedelic rock. The obsession with Eastern imagery in the rock and roll world was little more than a fat and giant trip. The Rolling Stones used an image of the Buddha on a poster of their infamous Altamont Speedway concert, which had no relation to Buddhism whatsoever. All Roger Law needed to do was put out Jimi Hendrix's face on Krishna's and replace the blue background with pink and gold to make it a staple of the psychedelic era. It was hosted with the expectation that people would go there and get high and maybe donate along the way. For rock stars, the use of Indian iconography was of religious significance, not to Buddhism or Hinduism, but to Hippism and everything it represented: peace, love, nonconformity, and all the above things. We're already at past half an hour now in this video. We're going to have to do a part 2 about the decline in the movement. So we've talked about the rise and the popularization and the true belief in these liberalizations, maybe even cultural liberations, and this radicalism that's about to follow in the next video that we shall discuss. So I'm going to leave it for there. Comment, subscribe, and if anyone who happens to watch this video remembers this time, tell us what you remember in the comments. So adios, and I'll see you in the next video.